Our story begins in the middle of the Baltic Sea, on a Danish merchant ship sailing to Prussian shores. On board is a young, seasick, and disheartened merchant, a Christian called Lars. The medieval book Liber Sensus Danae mentions a merchant who traveled to the territories of the Baltic tribes to spy on behalf of the Danish king, Valdemar II. Lars will be our eyes and ears in the lands of the last pagans of Europe.
Had I known the fate that awaited me, I would never have set out on this journey. But I was young then and knew little of people in the world. I knew my craft well, where to find goods for low prices, and places I could sell them for a profit. I met an old merchant friend of my father's at the port. He had come here to buy amber. He praised the goods I had brought with me and advised me not to travel the pagan lands without a local guardsman. For one offering, a bar of local currency, I hired a man named Kurshaitis. He was the youngest son in his family and could not inherit his family's property. So Kurshaitis sold his strength and skills for money instead. As was the custom, I exchanged gifts with my father's friend. He gave me an amber necklace. I must say, pagans or not, they had very fine artisans. When I offered him something in return, he declined, suggesting I'd better keep Christian symbols to myself. Even though Prussians were a peace-loving people, these were not safe times. When planning the long and dangerous journey, I read about a merchant city called Trousseau in King Valdemar's archives, where Danes, Gotlanders and Swedes met and traded with the pagans peacefully and amicably. When I arrived in Trousseau, it was nothing like the description and instead resembled a small fishing village. The once renowned city of the Amber Road had lost its former glory and fallen into decay. As the evening progressed, I began to think that the pagans were not as frightening as I had thought, and that the Prussians were not so different from us Christians. My feeling of comfort came to an end when I witnessed an event that made my blood run cold. The Prussians had captured and shackled a Holy Father.
Christianity swept like a tidal wave from the Roman Empire across Europe, changing its world forever. Upon converting to Christianity, the pagans renounced their gods and their way of life, and gradually accepted European Christian values and customs, including new social structures, property rights and laws. The Prussian territory, home to several small related Baltic tribes, was the borderland between the last remaining pagans of Europe and Christendom.
I was horrified by what I saw, and I remembered my last confession. Lars, the bishop, had said, "It's time to convert the pagans to the Christian faith. You will be our eyes and ears in the pagan land. Watch and listen carefully, because when you return, we shall expect to hear every detail. May God be with you, son." I had heard that for the past several hundred years, the Church had been preaching the teachings of Christ in the Prussian lands, trying to turn the pagans to the one true faith, but not to avail. The priest's only crime had been that unknowingly, much to his misfortune, or rather his willful ignorance, he had entered a sacred forest to gather firewood. A peasant saw this and reported the crime. Kuršaitis knew that whenever gods were involved, a pagan priest, Krievs, would settle the dispute. The pagans called it the trial of the gods, but this had nothing to do with our Christian gods. I felt sick to my stomach when I learned how the pagans determined whether a person was guilty or not. Those involved in the dispute had to pull a stone out of a pot of boiling water and hold it in their hands for a few moments. Unfortunately, and understandably so, the hand of the servant of God was not accustomed to such savagery, so the pagans declared him guilty. My blood ran cold when I saw the wild joy with which the pagans gathered to watch the trial.
As other Baltic tribes, Prussians venerated specific natural sites, large stones, springs, or ancient trees and wood groves, where they performed their religious rites and rituals. Written records mention Prussia's most important holy site, Romove, a place of pagan worship overseen by a pagan high priest, Kriviu Krivaitis, or Krivo Krivs. The pagans believed that the spirits of their ancestors lived in sacred forests. In fact, the ancient Prussian symbol for the world was the oak. The gods lived in its branches. The Prussians worshipped gods of the sky, the earth, and the underworld, and believed that various natural and animal deities lived all around them. These deities influenced everyday life, such as weather, health, fertility, life after death, and fortune in war. They sacrificed food and livestock to the gods. One archaeological sacrificial site revealed a stone idol and the remains of more than 200 horses. Lars' journey continues through the lands of the Galindians and Yatvingians. In the early Middle Ages, these territories were sparsely inhabited, and the battles with their Christian neighbors led to the demise or assimilation of both these peoples.
Few people lived in the Galindian lands, which were covered in thick forests and mostly inhabited by wild animals. The hill forts were abandoned, and with no cities, I could not do any trading. Kurshaitis knew that the Galindians had a custom of never refusing a meal or shelter to a traveler if requested. So, seeking shelter for the night, we did not hesitate to enter a Galindian farmstead.
Several closely related families often lived together in fortified farmsteads. Most buildings were made of horizontal logs, built directly on the land without brick foundations. The windows were small and usually covered with animal bladders or sealed with wooden shutters. The log roofs were covered with layers of spruce or birch bark. Records indicate that the Galindians also built residential towers whose height could have indicated the prestige of its owner.
The pagan diet was similar to ours. They ate peas, beans, and lentils, as well as root crops, turnips, black radish, onions, garlic. Meat was salt-cured in barrels so it would last the winter. To my great surprise, the pagans did not build chimneys, and even the wealthy were unaware that every respectable house should have a stove with a chimney flue. The Galindians treated us with a meal they highly enjoyed called svidini, a sweet scone made out of rye flour, fried and then boiled in pork fat soup. To be honest, these svidini were not very tasty, but we ate everything our host offered us out of respect and hunger from our long journey. That evening, we were served by the owner's wives and drelji, the local name for slaves. As in other Baltic tribes, having many wives was common among the Galindians. I noticed that our host was particularly fond of his youngest wife, And while the oldest wife managed the household, the middle one seemed to be in need of a man's attention. I will say this, pagan women were in no way worse than those raised in accordance with the Christian faith. And in some ways, maybe they were even better. The next morning, visibly nervous, Kurshaitis told me that the servants had seen what had happened last night. Even Galindian hospitality has its limits, so we had to leave quickly. Kurshaitis warned us of impending pursuit, but unfortunately, I paid little heed to what he said, as I did not feel that sleeping with a pagan woman, even though a married one, had been such a serious sin. Suddenly, a few well-aimed arrows from the woods meant that our Galindian host had taken offense. He engaged the aid of his relatives and servants so they could hunt us down. Fortunately, Kurshaitis knew that the sacred forest lay just beyond the river and that the Galindians would never dare to follow us there. I didn't notice that my fellow companions took me deeper inland, into the lands of the Jotvingians and the Sudovians. The Lord was by my side and we slipped away from the Galindians and reached a local healer who agreed to nurse me back to health for a small fee.
In the Middle Ages, the smallest injury or illness could prove fatal. The average lifespan was just 25 to 30 years due to malnutrition, the relatively harsh climate, unsanitary conditions, and lack of medicine. The most difficult stage in life was childhood, and half of the children did not survive.
By taking us into the sacred woods, Kurshite saved our lives, but he seemed concerned and frightened. He had violated the order of his pagan gods and feared their wrath. To beg their forgiveness, Kurshite offered the gods his hair, thereby lowering his status in society and, for a time, voluntarily likening himself to a slave. I was still sick, with a fever and barely conscious. Later, Kurshites told me that curing my wound was beyond human means, so they had asked the pagan gods for help. A Yatwingian priest offered a goat as a sacrifice in my favor. This ritual seemed more like a celebration to me because they had bought beer with my money and every man in the clan took part. The pagan gods frightened me then. While we honored our god with bread and wine, their gods demanded the blood of dead livestock.
As 16th century Lutheran theologians' records offer insight into a Yotvingian goat sacrifice ritual. However, as the account is from a Christian point of view, it must be viewed with some skepticism. The blood of the sacrificial animal was drained into a dish. Some of it was sprinkled on ritual participants, and the remaining blood was used to similarly bless their homes and livestock. An important part of the ritual was the cooking and eating of the animal. While the meat boiled, the men took flatbreads made from wheat and buckwheat dough and tossed them to each other through the fire until the breads were cooked. Other rituals describe a priest taking a glowing ember, placing it on his bare head, and then tossing it back into the fire. Long horns were blown during the ritual.
Miraculously, my wound healed and I regained my strength. I cannot say whether it was God's grace or the pagan witchcraft that proved so strong. But I got my health back and I could continue my journey to fulfill my task to learn more about the pagan lands.
Having regained his strength, Lars makes his way to Lithuanian territories. Lithuanians and their Aukštaičiai kin have been described in various chronicles as powerful, militant, and savage people. They were known to terrorize their neighbors. The Chronicle of Henry of Livonia notes that in 1205, some 2,000 Lithuanian horsemen rode to the Estonian lands to plunder them and threatened to destroy the local trade metropolis, Riga, upon their return. According to written records, Lithuanians had no fear of death. It was an honor to die in a battle, and sometimes they took their own lives rather than surrender to their enemies. This is in stark contrast to the Christians, who considered suicide horrifying and one of the greatest sins a Christian could commit. The threat of Christian crusaders encouraged Duke Mindaugas to conquer other Lithuanian and Aukštaitija rulers to unify these lands into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Mindaugas converted to Christianity and was crowned king with the blessing of the Roman Pope Innocent IV. However, as the military threat from his Christian neighbors diminished, he renounced his newly adopted faith and banished all monks and priests from his lands. At the height of its glory in the 15th century, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania became the largest European state and a significant military force, bringing together various faiths, languages, and cultures.
I arrived at a large city called Kernavė, considered to be the most important city of the Lithuanian duchy. Neither Kuršaitis nor I had ever seen such a city, covering 5 hill forts. My misfortunes were behind me, and they receded in my memory as a wicked adventure, which, when I returned to Denmark, would surely enthrall many listeners.
Kernavė has been an inhabited area since the Stone Age. Unlike other medieval settlements, it did not have a defensive wall, but the city was protected by its favorable geographical location near the marshy banks of the Neris River. In times of peace, the inhabitants lived in villages near the hill forts or on the surrounding farmsteads. In the event of an attack or siege, they could take shelter in the forts, each of which could house up to 300 people.
Back then, as I left Kernavė behind me, I thought that I had some understanding of the order established in the pagan lands. But once again, I could not believe my eyes. Even though I had heard that there were Eastern or Byzantine preachers in these lands, I was surprised to see that they had succeeded in building a church in a land hostile towards Christ. As a Catholic, the Byzantine faith was rather foreign to me. I hoped to speak with the Holy Father, as I was sure that we shared the same God. The Holy Father could not control his anger towards me. I didn't know the reason of his frustration, but maybe it was because my brothers of faith had just attacked and pillaged Constantinople, the center of Byzantine Church. Probably he was furious to all Catholics, but honestly, even I did not understand and could not justify their actions. But what's done is done. At least I managed to acquire some horses in Kernavė, which would surely make our journey easier and faster. I also stocked up on some goods that I intended to sell for good profit elsewhere. The horse trader, well acquainted with the neighboring territories, suggested I go north, where many rich castles could be found and a great river called the Daugava flows.
In the 1st century of our era, the Roman senator and historian Tacitus, in his famous work Germania, described the ancestors of the Baltic tribes as, in producing of grain and the other fruits of the earth, they labor with more assiduity and patience than is suitable to the usual laziness of Germans. To reach the renowned water route of the river Daugava and its ports, Lars and his men had to cross the forested and fertile territory of Silonia. During the 10th to the 13th centuries, the Silonian territory covered several districts with about 30 hill forts and had its center in the city of Sailpils.
In Salonia, I witnessed some unbelievable events that would have been impossible in Christendom. During the summer solstice, the pagans not only decorated their livestock, guiding them around fields and meadows and singing all the while in the belief that this would ensure a bountiful harvest, they also engaged in lewd debauchery that was not practiced in their daily life. I felt and with blasphemy, carrying away the women as well as the men. The pagans may have some this is the best time for a woman to conceive. Children then would be born in March and therefore live the first.
To prepare for the mystery and spirit of the solstice celebration, various aids were known to be used. Ethnographic materials and folklore suggest that the Baltic tribes knew psychotropic plants well. The meadows were home of one of the most hallucinogenic mushrooms in the world, the Liberty Cap, while the forests were full of fly agaric mushrooms, a favorite among Sami shamans and the neighboring Vikings. It is possible that hemp, mugwort, poppies, marsh Labrador tea, henbane, and belladonna were also used in rituals and medicine. However, further research is needed into the ethnobotany of the ancient Balts. During the summer solstice, people celebrated the victory of light over darkness. Fire symbolized the sun, the goddess of life, fertility, warmth, and health. During the longest day and shortest night of the year, people participated in the ritual of purification, signifying a simultaneous ushering in of new life and a struggle against death. All societal groups were welcome in the summer solstice celebrations. All were considered equal in their union with the supernatural and amongst themselves.
I felt very odd after the pagan solstice celebration. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something had changed. The pagans truly lived in unison with nature, and I felt it too. It was as if everything was permeated by the divine, and I was a part of it. And I wondered whether I was truly the highest being on earth, or merely a part of something greater. The journey ahead took us to the land of Ladgale and to the river of Daugava, which was so wide and so deep that we had to pay a ferryman to get us across.
In the 13th century, the Latgalians were the most populous of the Baltic tribes, with about 50 to 70,000 people living in the territory. The river Daugava had long been an important trade route between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East. The Scandinavians, Slavs, and North Germanic merchants all used cunning, force, or advantageous offers of alliances to seize control of the Daugava waterway. The Latgalians who lived on the banks of the river Daugava were often among the first to suffer from their encounters with the merchants, Christian priests, and crusaders. In Latgale, Christianity was spread by representatives of both the Catholic and Orthodox churches, who fought over the souls of the local pagans. Some of the Latgalian political elite voluntarily converted to the teachings of Christ. Perhaps they sought to gain strong allies in the battle against neighboring tribes, or saw new opportunities in a different world, one brought to them by foreigners. Enemies and allies often switched sides during the Northern Crusades, depending on the situation. The Livonian chronicler Henry describes a typical Latgalian and German raid on Estonian lands. They destroyed the surrounding land, burned houses and villages, captured and killed many pagans, took women and children captive, seized livestock and horses, and returned home 7 days later in good spirit, were willing to pay to be able to bury the deceased properly.
Even though I had spent quite some time in the pagan lands, I had not met German crusaders before. Kurschaitis explained that the pagans and crusaders sometimes joined forces on common raids. Both sides benefited, increasing the prospect of defeating the enemy and pillaging the goods. I couldn't understand how enemies could march together like this. But I suspected that this unlikely alliance might have helped to spread the teachings of Christ and plant God's vineyard in the thicket of the pagans' forests.
The Crusades offered an opportunity for Christians to obtain land, wealth, and even aristocratic status. The plunder was perceived as just rewards for the difficult work of spreading Christianity. Not everyone, however, who joined the Crusades to the pagan lands did so solely out of greed. The ideology for the Crusades was purposeful. The Catholic faith must be brought to the pagans neighboring the Holy Roman Empire. Crusaders fought in the pagan territories for the short term, yet, in order to control the conquered territories, they needed a permanent military force. Following the example of the Knights Templar, the first order of knights outside of the Mediterranean was founded in Riga. They were called the Livonian Brothers of the Sword and were comprised of warrior monks.
A Holy Father invited us to spend the night in a Crusader camp. My king, Valdemar the Victorious, wanted to obtain lands along the coast of this sea. However, what I have seen leads me to believe that it might be not as easy as he thinks. German merchants and crusaders were already feeling quite at home in these lands and shared their lives with the pagans. I saw how they split the loot after a successful raid. Part of it was offered to the gods, and not just by the pagans, but by the believers of the one true God as well. I was surprised by the actions of my brothers of the cross. Even though there are Christians in Denmark and elsewhere who still honor the gods of their ancestors, to openly worship pagan gods seemed a sin. Even the Holy Father pretended not to see these activities.
Lars' travels brings him to a town on the banks of the river A, now known as the Gauja. The lands around the Gauja and the Daugava were sparsely populated by the Finno-Ugric tribes of Wends and Livonians, whose ethnic roots are the mixture of Balts, Scandinavians, and Baltic Finns. Although neither the Wends nor the Livonians were Balts, the medieval history of the Baltic lands is incomplete without the Finno-Ugric peoples of the region. Finno-Ugric peoples held an animistic worldview. Everything in nature was interconnected and had an immortal soul. The Balts may have adopted their myths of many goddesses, such as the earth, forest, wind, and sea mothers, directly from the Wends and Livonians. The pagan form of god worship was showing reverence to nature in all its forms. It is believed that pagans didn't idolize trees, rocks, and hills as literal and tangible things. The objects of their worship were similar to windows, simultaneously visible and transparent. Natural objects served as a material mediator through which perception was connected to revelation.
I found myself in a large Livonian trading center, not far from a castle called Turaida, also known as the Garden of Tur. I exchanged a few words with the salt merchant who had come here from the German lands. He complained how difficult it was to trade with the pagans, because every ruler wanted to collect a fee on goods passing through his land. As a merchant, I understood him well and shared his hopes that these lands would soon be brought to order. I didn't know the many local tongues, but this was no obstacle for trading. Sign language was used all over the world.
Goods could be paid for by barter with valuable wax or salt, which was easily measurable. The unit of currency in the Baltic Sea region was a roughly 200-gram piece of silver called the ossuring. Smaller units of currency were simply chopped off of it. The term ossuring is believed to have meant horse's ring, as one ossuring was worth one horse. In the 13th century Baltic Sea region, one horse was equal to 3 cows, 20 sheep, 10 pigs, or 1 slave.
I had decided to bring beeswax, a famed good of the pagan lands, back to Denmark. With many forest bee trees on this side of the sea, wax was much cheaper. I had heard that most churches, monasteries, and manor houses in Western Europe were lit with wax gathered by the Balts and the Rus. I successfully traded my remaining blades and spear tips for a few wheels of beeswax. I was planning on making quite a fortune by selling them in Denmark. I wished to spend a small share of this fortune for my own enjoyments. In addition to high-demand goods such as furs, grains, linen and hemp, the Turaida market also offered slave women. Kurshaitis saw a familiar face among them and pointed her out to me. I was surprised to recognize the second wife of the Galindian landlord. She had apparently been sold into slavery. But I couldn't imagine this woman in either my bed or in my house. So I chose another slave girl, pleasing to the eye and, as the merchant claimed, subservient and obedient by nature. I had seen enough of the pagan lands, so it was time to return home. I decided to head down the river towards the port city of Riga, where I was bound to find passage to Danish lands before the sea froze over.
Riga should be viewed in a separate category from the other cities Lars had visited on his journey. The influx of Germanic, Gotlandic, and Danish merchants had merged 2 small Livonian settlements, forming Riga, the metropolis of the future state of Livonia. In just a few decades, Riga's Dolomite Wall was built to protect merchant homesteads and warehouses, churches, monasteries, multiple castles. Written sources poetically describe Riga as a colonial outpost in hostile lands and a Christian citadel erected boldly in Satan's territory. The origins of the city of Riga as a Christian center date back to the early 13th century when Christianity arrived on German merchant ships. The merchants did not come to baptize the native pagans, but rather to manage trading routes into the land of the Rus. The timing of the Crusades was advantageous to the merchants, enabling them to help subdue these lands under the guise of spreading Christianity. Since the Livonians and the Wends were the first tribes to encounter the merchants, they were also the first tribes on the eastern shores of the Baltic Sea to be forced to adopt the Christian faith. Historical evidence regarding the baptizing of local pagans is contradictory and describes both willing and enforced conversions to Christianity. The Chronicle of Henry of Livonia describes a day when Christian priests baptized the pagans en masse. More often, however, the Christian faith was unwelcome. The same chronicle describes the disobedience of newly baptized Livonians, who afterwards cleansed themselves of the baptism in the Daugava, believing they were sending Christianity back to Germany.
It was a surprising coincidence that I met my father's friend in Riga, the same merchant I had already met in the struggling town of Trousseau. He told me that Riga would soon resemble the largest cities of Denmark and Gotland. He urged me to establish ties quickly and to make arrangements with local German and Gotlandian merchants, explaining that the Germans would soon take control of the Daugava waterway, securing the trade route to the Rus and Constantinople. In the marketplace, I ran over a theater performance. It was a traveling acting company which used a translator to present the play in the local language. By my reckoning, the play was about the prophets and the origins of Christianity. But when my eyes met with pagan eyes, I could clearly see that they did not understand the purpose of the play. They were being shown the way to true peace and eternal life, but all they could see with their devilish eyes was filthy entertainment that caused mad laughter. After the long and difficult journey through the pagan lands, I was exhausted. Obviously, my body's fluids had become corrupted, so I decided to go to the nearby Daugavgriva Cistercian Abbey to see the monks who knew how to heal both spirit and flesh.
In medieval Europe, phlebotomy or bloodletting was a cornerstone of early medicine. It was a widely recognized method of treatment, grounded in the assumption that a person was healed after harmful fluids were drained from the body. Bloodletting was used to treat almost all internal and external ailments and was also used as a preventive treatment.
I must say that my strength had not yet returned to my body, but my spirit was strong and I was ready to head home. We were on our way back to Riga when an unexpected misfortune befell us.
Historical records mention several raids near the Riga city walls in early 13th century by Estonians from the island of Ösel, or as they are called in the chronicles, Öselians. They were particularly cruel towards Christians. They tortured German preachers, kidnapped newly baptized Livonians, and stole their cattle. Lars is captured and taken by ship to Estonian lands. The Estonians are a Baltic Finno-Ugric people related to the Livonians and the Wends and are known as either mainlanders or islanders. The Öselians were the most difficult for the Christians to conquer. In the 13th century, Valdemar II of Denmark, the Swedish army and the Bishop of Riga, with the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, made several attempts to conquer them. The Öselians' ability to resist the Crusaders may have been due to their military organization, the geographic placement of Oslo, or possibly bravery based on their belief in the protection and might of pagan gods. The names of various gods and deities live on in Estonian folklore to this day. An ancient myth says that the world spun around an eternal tree to which the sky was nailed with stars. The Milky Way, or as the Estonians say, the Bird's Way, was a branch of this tree along which birds carried the souls of the dead into other worlds. Similar animistic myths about the structure of the world are found in other Finno-Ugric cultures, all the way to Lapland. The ancient chronicles contain references to the Estonian supreme god Tarapita, who flew over the sea and landed on Ösel.
Unlike my less fortunate companions, the Öselian raiders did not kill me. I think the death of my father's friend was also an unfortunate accident, as the scoundrels would have received a much higher ransom for 2 Danish men. Once a well-respected, honorable merchant, I had now become a slave. We were treated almost like cattle. We were not treated poorly, though the food could have been better. I spent several years in slavery and abandoned any hope that my family would ever buy me out of this humiliating servitude. Other prisoners, who had already spent some time in captivity, told me that slaves who did their work well could even be promoted to overseer of the household. So, I did the best I could. I learned the local language while working for an Australian blacksmith near Tuyu, where locals mined ore and smelted it into iron. I never thought about where and how iron was obtained when I traded blades. The digging and smelting of swamp ore on Ösel was some of the hardest work I had ever done. Sometimes the furnace we had built just outside the forest had to be pumped with bellows for several days before the iron bits separated from the ore. It was easier in the smithy, where all I did was bring firewood and water, keep the fire going in the forge, pump bellows for several hours, and help the blacksmith in various other ways. In time, I came to love the blacksmith, and he became almost like a father to me, or perhaps even a mother. The blacksmith was also well respected and held high esteem in the village. No wonder. The horses were always shoed, and women adorned themselves with bronze jewelry and sewed clothes with needles. Yet, my master's most highly esteemed skill was that of forging weapons, for an Australian's life was unimaginable without a blood-stained sword in his hand.
Written sources describe Estonians from Ösel as the most wicked enemies of the Christianity. The Chronicle of Henry of Livonia describes a cruel incident. Estonians ripped out the heart of a Christian castle overseer. They cooked it over a fire, divided it amongst themselves, and ate it so that they would become courageous against Christians. His flesh they fed to the dogs and to the birds of the sky. We will never know whether this really happened or was it written to scare with the wickedness of the pagans.
In the animal world, the weaker exist only as food for the stronger. The pagans thought in much the same way. The raiders considered the settlements of other tribes as places to be plundered for captives, cattle, weapons, and other goods. If they did not do so, someone else would. I was brought along on raids as an interpreter to negotiate ransoms with the captives' relatives. This was not easy, as I saw the grief and suffering we caused. But I had learned a simple truth in my time with the pagans. If you run with the wolves, you must howl with them. As soon as the ice retreated from the sea, the Australians went raiding. They often joined forces with their neighbors, the Curonians. Returning from one of our raids, we docked on the Curonian shore to divide the booty. I had begun to feel like I belonged with the Australians, but I was sold like a simple animal.
Lars has arrived in Curonian lands. The territory of ancient Courland consisted of several kingdoms formed around castles or kiligundas. Scandinavian merchants and artisans had been building settlements in Courland since the middle of the first millennium and established close trade relations with the nearby Gotland. Yet, written sources mention wars and raids between the Curonians, Swedes, and Danes more frequently than trade. For several centuries, the Curonians partially ruled the Baltic Sea, but from the 13th century onwards, North German merchants took advantage of the Crusades to gain control. of the old trade routes that later turned into the Hanseatic League. Sensing that their former might was fading, the Curonians attacked the Christian center Riga in 1210. After a 3-day siege, Crusader reinforcements arrived, forcing the Curonians to retreat. They gathered their fallen and spent 3 more days nearby, mourning and burning their dead.
The Curonians were like wild beasts. They would not give up their forest and be domesticated to live like cattle with foreign masters. But they had learned the same simple truth I had. If you can't beat them, join them. Hoping to avoid terrible bloodshed in endless battles against the Germans, Danes, and Swedes, the Curonians adopted the Christian faith with the Pope's blessing. Yet it was clear to me that the Curonians only called themselves Christians to fool their foreign masters, because the pagans were not about to forget their ancestral gods. Moreover, at the time of the winter solstice, I witnessed the Curonians hunting in their sacred forest, where during the previous year they never killed a beast, nor did they fell a single tree. During the solstice, the shortest day of the year, the pagans wore masks, believing they held the spirits of their ancestors, which let them communicate with their dead relatives and the gods of nature. Lamekins had heard that the neighboring tribe, the Samogitians, were preparing a battle against the German crusaders. So he offered to sell a large number of weapons to the Samogitian Duke Vykintas. Although they often quarreled and warred, this was no obstacle to a mutually beneficial deal. I would laugh if I weren't crying at how remarkably and insistently fate kept throwing obstacles in my way. Lamekins sold me for a wineskin full of expensive wine. And so, in the winter of the year of our Lord 1235, I was sent to Samogitia along with the Curonian shipment of weapons. Duke Vykintas rode ahead with his riders and village elders, and we followed behind more slowly as we were encumbered by the amount of goods. On the way, I once again realized that the given word was not to be trusted. The Samogitians could expect kindness, hospitality, and care from Lamekins. But despite the agreed-upon truce, my companions attacked simple Curonian folk fishing on the ice and robbed them of their catch. But such was the custom, and the Curonians would not have acted any differently given the opportunity. Our path was difficult and dangerous, as the ice had become fragile after the thaw. It was no surprise that it could not hold so many people, and some of us fell through. One unfortunate man met his end in the icy water. If he was baptized, he would have been brought back to his family for a proper burial. But nobody cared about the body of a pathetic servant. So we left him to the wolves.
Lars, now carrier of goods, was on the road to Samogitian lands. As the story suggests, many of the Baltic peoples fought fiercely against the preachers of Christianity. Samogitia too was turned into a battlefield during the Crusades, and they fought fiercely for 200 years to hold back the expansion of the state of Teutonic order. The Samogitians are considered to be the last pagan tribe of Europe, adopting Christianity only in the 15th century. Their settlements were surrounded by thick forests and deep, expansive marshes with hidden underwater paths, known only to the locals and providing good defense against invaders. This terrain was easier to traverse during the winter, so most trading and fighting usually occurred then.
I reached the Samogitian village during time of mourning. After all I had seen in the pagan lands, the sight did not surprise me. The body of the deceased was dressed in ceremonial clothes and footwear and was seated at the table with the living, taking part in the funeral feast while his kin ate, drank, and feasted. People lamented throughout the evening, and the relatives wailed and listed the worldly possessions of the deceased, namely his wife, children, sheep, cows, horses, geese, and other goods. They drank all night and asked the deceased to pass their regards on to their friends in the beyond. I suppose the deceased was the only one silent. I was still a stranger, so I was not allowed to come near. I watched from afar as they finished their drinks and tossed the vessels into the grave along with a loaf of bread, some salt and weapons. I heard talk of a fee the deceased would have to pay the ferryman for passage across the underworld river, so they placed jewelry and silver coins next to the ashes. After so many years in the pagan lands, I no longer knew to whom I belonged, the Christians or the pagans. I sometimes wondered whether the pagan gods weren't just part of our one great God, and whether their sacred hills and forests weren't like churches, and their solstice festivals, celebrations of the birth of our Savior. These thoughts frightened me, so I fended them off, for they would surely condemn me to hell as a Christian. A large force of crusaders had landed on the seashore. Seeking allies, Samogitian Duke Vikintas sent envoys to the neighboring Semigallian region of Tervete, hoping to make an alliance and to devise a plan with his former rivals to drive the crusaders off. A strange feeling came over me when I heard the crusaders' war efforts were succeeding. Was this my chance to regain my freedom?
In the 13th century, Semigalian tribes were governed by two main castle districts, Tervete and Mejoetne. The Semigalians and their neighbors, the Samogitians, were fierce enemies and often waged war against each other. The Crusades put these old conflicts to rest, and many Semigalians fleeing the Crusaders migrated to Samogitia.
This was not the first time I saw the pagans use divination to reveal their future. They threw animal bones in the fire and watched the direction of the smoke and looked for images, which would foretell whether to fight or stay at home. The Samogitians had come to the Semigalians with an offer to join forces and attack the Crusaders, who, after raiding Lithuanian lands, were about to return to Riga to sail home to North Germany before the winter. This attack was meant to defeat the Brothers of the Cross once and for all. And here was my chance to escape servitude. The Samogitian lord said to me, "We want to decide for ourselves how to live and which gods to worship, not to live under the rule of foreign conquerors. Lars, come fight with us, and I will set you free for the rest of your days." What was I to do? What sins had I committed that God, in His almighty judgment, should punish me so? That remained a mystery to me. I spent many nights praying to God to have mercy on me. My prayers went unanswered, and I sometimes thought my Lord had abandoned me. But now, armed with the spear and marching into battle against my brothers in faith, I smelt the scent of the forest and the taste of blood, and freedom began to pulsate in my old veins. We knew we would face the entire army of Crusaders and Sword Brothers. But there were many of us too. Maybe 4,000 or 5,000 Lithuanians, Samogitians and Semigalians, outnumbering our enemy. Our plan was to strike at dawn, using the marshy terrain to our advantage.
The archives contain several descriptions of the events of the Battle of Shaule, directly translated, Battle of the Sun. The most prevalent belief is that the pagan army cut the Crusaders off. Falkvin, the master of the Brothers of the Sword, had warned the Crusaders of the impending danger in the battle, but the exhausted knights and mercenaries disregarded the advice and set up camp for the night. The pagan army launched a sudden attack the next morning, catching the Crusaders off guard. Having lost the advantage of a significant cavalry, the surrounded Brothers of the Sword and Crusaders were killed. The slaughter was so quick and brutal that the Brothers of the Sword became the source of mockery in the Livonian Rhymed Chronicle, the most famous surviving written record of the time. It is believed that most of the mercenaries, Germans, Latgalians, Livonians, Estonians, and Rus of Pskov, were overwhelmed by the pagan forces and fled the battlefield. Their retreat was cut off, and they were slain by the strategically placed Senegalians. The Order of the Brothers of the Sword was crushed in the Battle of the Schaule, but new armies soon replaced them. Fate has not been kind to the Baltic peoples. In the centuries to come, the eastern shores of the Baltic Sea would see foreign powers come and go, but the Baltic peoples maintained their unique identity, based in nature and the land, never strength, persistence, spite, and will of their ancestors to survive.
And that story will continue. The blood in our veins flows from the past throughout human history. Times change. People's lives and customs change. Our knowledge of the order of the world and our values change. But human nature remains the same. These natural laws have ruled us for thousands of years. Looking back, we are faced with shadows of the past, asking, will we water the roots of the tree of life with blood or clear water?